wanted to start with a question. Do you understand why women are so often unnerved and uncomfortable with Mary, Mother of Jesus, as she is presented in the Catholic tradition? Can you understand this nerve and being against or uncomfortable or looking for ways for such an important figure in the tradition?
I think she's been used to control women, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a convert, so I didn't grow up with this image of the Virgin Mother, an impossible image for ordinary women. That was never imposed on me. In fact, on the contrary, as a Protestant, Mary was seen as something really almost demonic about Catholicism. You know, like Catholics worship Mary, and that was seen as a really terrible thing. So when I converted to Catholicism, I had already made my mind up that I wasn't going to have anything to do with Mary.
Mm-hmm.
It took me some time to begin to look at her, and I had very young children at the time, and I realized that, and it was quite an unhappy time in my life, and as a very new Catholic, I used to take the children to school and then go into the parish church to pray afterwards. And there was a dusty old Pieta there, very sentimental, not great art. But it was the first time that I'd found a symbol in my Christian faith of maternal love and suffering. And she began to mean a lot because of that. But of course, that's very different from Catholic women who were brought up in a Catholic culture, Poland, Ireland, women I speak to all over the world, who were just oppressed by this image of purity and of modesty and obedience and humility. And I think the sad thing is this is a very modern, reductive image, kind of 19th century romanticism gets forged with male fear of female sexuality. And what I've done in my own research is to try and find other images of Mary. Now, one way of doing that, of course, is to look at feminist theology, liberation theology, where she becomes the peasant woman of the poor. The Magnificat becomes a very revolutionary song of praise. I was interested actually to discover that apparently in imperial India, in the Raj, the British would not allow the Magnificat to be sung in churches because it might give ideas to the people. So there's that way of interpreting her. But for me, if we only have that way, we end up with an overly politicized faith. So the other thing I do is to go back to early and medieval texts and art, and what I discover there is this potent power of nature, an awesome maternal power. And when virginity is spoken of in that context in the very early church, it's not really about sexual abstinence in the earliest writings. It's the way today we would talk about the virgin forest or the virgin ocean. It means a power of nature that hasn't been controlled and dominated by men. So in fact, it's the very opposite to the function that virginity has in more modern interpretations of Mary. It's an awesome force of nature that God redeems from within with a woman's assent. And to me, we can do both those things. We can look at modern liberationist feminist readings, and we can look at the awesome power of the Marian tradition. I don't think what we can do is to stick with this young virgin in a blue dress. You know, now I look at sort of the Madonna of Lourdes, and which incidentally Bernadette hated that statue. She said what I saw didn't look like that. But she doesn't even have a child in her arms. You know, she's this young, she looks like an advertisement for L'Oreal or something.
Yeah.
And I think we do need to get away from that. It's a very destructive image for young girls and women.
Like, you know, the same way as it is, you know, with, I don't know, models and the body images, or in the deeper sense also?
Both, really. I think, you know, the body image of the pale-faced, beautiful virgin. I mean, always in the representation of Mary, she has represented whatever the female or feminine or maternal ideal is in that culture and at that time. She's always the most perfect woman. But I think the problem is, as that becomes more and more invested with male fantasies and projections, which certainly in modernity it has, we lose the capacity of Mary to represent how women see themselves. A lot of medieval art, when I look at it closely, is to me suffused with real female presence. Mary and the female saints live in a domestic environment or in a garden. The locus of the incarnation is domestic. Jesus's humanity is lived out among women. Even if his divinity comes from God the Father, his humanity comes from his mother. And I think we need to recapture that sense of women being able to see themselves in this image, but also to see an ideal. I think there's nothing wrong with ideals and aspirations if they're real, but you know, we don't want to be anorexic virgins. That's just not helpful.
And girls who are mothers, and I mean there are so many associations there. Also, she's pale, light skin. It's really hard to identify for half of the 2/3 or 3/4 of Catholics around the globe, right?
Well, I think something like 1 in 4 households in the world today is headed up by a single mother. Mary was a single mother. I mean, Joseph, you know, I think there's also a lot about Joseph that we should look at and reflect on and reclaim. You know, the man who loves a woman whose vocation with her son is the primary focus of his life, who forgoes his patriarchal right to claim her body and to bear children by her. You know, these are doctrines that have been oppressive to women, but to me, it's more creative to play with those and to ask what they can give us.
I was going to ask, because before we met, I took out, I even have those posters. This is one poster, but you know, I have more from workshops I did with women, young women mostly, about Mary. This one is actually pretty cool because it shows that there are layers in her, and there is a human being inside, but there are different layers of tradition on her. But anyway, so I dig those posters out from my cupboard and I read through them, and there was so much frustration or misunderstanding or like struggling with virginity topics. So you started to talk about it and you kind of reclaim it a different way. I see that for so many women, it just feels like this is impossible. Stop talking to me about it. At the same time, you're repressing female sexuality. Just go away with her and all of that. But I can hear you looking for something different here with virginity and Joseph and claiming body and not suppressing it. How we can not just drop it away from Catholic tradition, but just do something about it that will be constructive and inspiring.
For me, I see it as breaking the hold of the patriarchal world on the female body, not as anything to do really with sex as a loving human activity, but an acknowledgement that throughout history, throughout ancient history, the sexual female body has been abused, used, exploited. I mean, the myth of Genesis to me can be read as a myth of the beginnings of the sexual exploitation of women. You know, if we read what's said to Eve, your desire will be for your husband and he will lord it over you. That's a condemnation. It's not the way Pope John Paul II sometimes read it as kind of from the beginning, in the order of creation, men have authority. In fact, I think we need to question that. And the virgin birth, to me, is about restoring to women that fullness before God, and about a woman on her own being enough to mediate between creation and God. You know, when Mary says her fiat, it's the first ever act of consecration. It's the first time Christ bodily enters into the material world when she says, let it be. And she has to say, let it be. You know, it is also actually an affirmation of God's respect for the female body. Mary doesn't wake up and discover she's pregnant,
Mm-hmm.
which is what a lot of feminist interpreters get wrong. They say, oh, this is just like all the other Greek myths of virgin births. They all involve some kind of rape.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who first wrote that story knew those myths. Many of them had belonged to those religions. They knew what they were resisting. And I think they were resisting the violent claim over, the violent divine claim over a woman's body. And of course, if Mary had then had to go to Joseph and say, do you mind if we have sex? Because I've been told I'm going to get pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
The man, again, has the final word. But there was no male who had the final word when Jesus was conceived. And so for young women today, it's not about saying, don't have sex. It's about saying you are the only person authorized by God to say yes to what you choose to do with your body. And coercion, force in sexuality and childbearing, to me, are condemned in the virgin birth. But it's a big ask, you know, if a girl is brought up to say, Mary had never had sex, and if you have sex, you mustn't enjoy it, and you must make sure you get pregnant, because that's, you know, the price you pay for having sex. Well, how do you undo that? So it's easy for me as a theologian to sit here saying, oh, look, isn't it nice? But of course it's, yeah, I don't bear the burden of a Catholic upbringing.
Well, I mean, probably it's a lighter entrance into Catholic theology if you don't have to undo the, you know, the actual catechetical upbringing. I was happy I didn't have much of a Marian devotion at home, so for me it really was rediscovering her with feminist texts, with this context of Polish, you know, folk Catholicism and all of that I was trying to escape, but I didn't know, you know, I just didn't look first, and then I found her through feminist theology, and that was really exciting. But still, some of my friends, priests, were saying, you are going to write about Mary for your weekly? Seriously? Like a few years ago? You don't even know how to lead the rosary, so you're not the right person. Like, I just didn't grow up with it. I mean, that's not my fault. Yeah. That happens to people. But that's, when you were saying about her saying yes, and then incarnation happening, could we say this is a priestly image of Mary, or this is way too much? Or
it is a priestly image of Mary, and actually it's been played with in Catholic imagery since the early church.
Okay, so it's not only those new modern images that Catholic feminists and Roman Catholic women priests produce with her kid. It's earlier.
There's always been a fear of the female priest, and the best study I've read on this was by René Laurentin, Mary the Virgin Priest. It's a French 2-volume study that hasn't been translated, but he looks at the tradition from the beginning, and he makes the point that every title given to Christ had a Marian equivalent, so king and queen, Adam, new Eve, new Adam, new Eve, etc. But the one title they never gave to her was priest, priestess. And he says that started because of the eroticized cults of the world they were living in the early church. But then, of course, it becomes solidified in the tradition that she can't be. And even today, you know, we see conservative Catholics, I mean, women priests don't call themselves priestesses anyway, but that word priestess is used as a term of condemnation for women who aspire to ordination. But if you look at a lot of medieval art and devotion, it's very explicit. You know, there are paintings of Mary in priestly vestments, a lot of paintings of her. And one of the arguments that Laurentin says is, well, it's not that she was a priest, but that her body was like a vestment. It was the covering for the priest. But, you know, why not just take the most obvious meaning? That
she's a tabernacle, right? And you cover it this way.
Yes. And that lovely image you showed me, almost like Russian dolls, of the images in the images. I mean, there are some wonderful medieval paintings of St. Anne with the Virgin and the child, just like that, 3 bodies, one inside the other. So there's a lot we can play with. But Mary as priest, you know, there are 2 things I think we need to say. First of all, the first time someone enables the priest on the altar to say, this is my body, this is my blood, is when Jesus can say of Mary, this is my body, this is my blood, and she can say of him, this is my body, this is my blood. And the virgin birth makes that even more potent. And, you know, that's a theme in devotion. It was banned. Imagery and language of Mary, the virgin priest, was banned at the beginning of the 20th century, which to me is interesting, because when they ban something, they're acknowledging its power.
So maybe they started to feel uncomfortable with women emancipation.
Yes, I think
that's
so.
what happened with with Unia in the Bibles, right? I mean, she became Unias when women started to talk about being pastors in Protestant churches in 19th century. Suddenly, the Bible's critical editions started to have, you know, that problem with Unia moving to Unius.
Yeah,
so it's like a kind of a clear shift that people make.
Yeah,
that's interesting. I didn't think. You were writing about the matriarchal images also of Saint Anne, and you mentioned that now. Is there something there for us in this kind of a matriarchal, like double matriarchy that was presented in those images?
Definitely. I don't like to speak of matriarchy, because I think then we just exchange one hierarchy for another. And, you know, powerful mothers, powerful women can also
be also destructive. That's true.
So I like to think more about, well, I love the term atonement, because I think it's the only doctrinal word that comes from Old English, and in English it is at one meant. And I think everything we do as Christians should be seeking at one meant, whether it's in gender relationships or interfaith relationships or race relationships. What does at one meant mean in the healing of this the wound in the human soul? And for me, the figure of St. Anne, again, it's saying in Christ's humanity, what kind of family did he have? Who was his grandma? And one of the earliest texts that we have as a source for St. Anne and Joachim is the Proto-Evangelium of James, which dates back to the 2nd century. And it's very, very early. It's also a beautiful story on many levels. It's the only it's the only text I've ever come across where a woman gives thanks for the birth of a girl. When St. Anne gives birth to Mary, she says, what have I had? And they say a girl, and she says, God be praised this day, or something. Now, traditionally, the birth of a girl in traditional societies is not something to thank God for. So there's that. But there's also the fact that the Catholic Church has always resisted saying that Mary was conceived without sex. So the figure of Anne is modelled on Hannah, the mother of Samuel in the Old Testament. And the story in the Proto-Evangelium is that she's an old woman, and they haven't conceived a child. And the elders of Israel send Joachim into the wilderness as punishment, which is also interesting, because normally it's the woman who gets blamed when a marriage is infertile. And in this story, it's Joachim who gets expelled. And they both have a kind of annunciation. An angel appears to him in the desert, and to St. Anne weeping in her garden. And they rush to meet each other at the gates to Jerusalem. And there are thousands of medieval depictions of the embrace at the Golden Gate. It's a very erotic, beautiful depiction of married love. And, you know, he has his knee between her legs. It's really erotic. And then, of course, medieval theologians debated, well, they went home and had sex.
Probably not. You know, then they stopped.
God had, well, then they began to wonder, well, would it have been good sex, or would it have been a distasteful duty that they had to do? And so they debated that. But, you know, one theologian said, well, it was probably the best sex that's ever been had since the beginning of the world. And I like that version. So
that's medieval theologian saying?
That this was great sex. So the Immaculate Conception says, it was conception without original sin, but it wasn't conception without sex. And again, I think instead of women sort of just throwing all that away, it's actually more subversive to reclaim it. And
Mm-hmm.
to say to the custodians of doctrine, we want these doctrines to
Yeah.
be reclaimed as the significance of women, sexuality, love, all that.
I remember a discussion with a female pastor once, and usually those discussions goes like, like usually Protestants are saying like, well, you have a very weird way of thinking about Mary. And this time it was that she said, I really miss such a powerful female figure in the center of the faith. There is so much that you get offered by her figure that we, without exploring her and without this kind of theology that you have, are missing, which really was striking because I never thought about it this way, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in a Presbyterian culture,
Mm-hmm.
and I honestly think that patriarchy in Protestantism is a problem, because if you despise the mother of Jesus, or if you hold her in low regard, or if you say, as Karl Barth said, that, she's just a kind of vessel for the will of God,
Mm-hmm.
what are you saying about the relationship between God and humankind, but God and women? Are we really saying that this momentous agreement to have a child, that God overrides a woman's freedom? That's not doctrinally correct. The early fathers had a beautiful title for Mary. She was the rational paradise. So her body was like the virgin earth from which the first Adam was created.
Mm-hmm.
But she had freedom of choice. She had rationality. She could weigh up what she was being asked to do and make a decision. And St. Augustine, among others, has this meditation on Gabriel waiting while Mary thinks about this question and saying, come on, Mary, all of creation is waiting for your yes. Why are you keeping the angel waiting? And it shows how they used to think very creatively, and in a way that suggests the woman had a really significant role, and Augustine said he made a play on words in mentre and ventris. She conceived first in her mind and then in her womb. And that's also really important, because what's it saying to women who are raped or who conceive through sexual abuse and coercion, that you conceive first in your womb and now you must also conceive in your mind? Being biologically pregnant doesn't make you a mother.
Mm-hmm.
That's a decision. And that's something that I believe the Annunciation gives to Mary.
Okay, that's another thing that we never hear from the pulpit, I would say, when we hear about that moment. When you were saying that, I was thinking, and I'm not really well read in it, but I remember reading some young Mexican feminist theologians, like liberation theologians, debating what is the role of Virgin Mary and all of her notion in that kind of healing process for so many women who are sexually abused or trafficked. And I really couldn't grasp it, so that actually helped me. I don't know, like, how on earth Virgin Mary as an image helps you cope with your harassment and abuse, sexual abuse, and that probably is somehow that, like, the way you can do it. What you mentioned.
I remember seeing a photograph of a child prostitute. I think it was in Manila, actually, on her bed, and above the bed she had a picture of the Virgin Mary, and it was clear that picture was there for her. Obviously not for her clients. But also, one of the other things that interests me about the early church, Mary as the new Eve, is a very subtle and complex relationship that, again, in the dualism of modernity, became wicked Eve, good Mary.
Yeah, now we miss it. It's something that many Catholics say, like, oh yeah, that's like mythology. Like, come on, like, that's too much. You need to really like this kind of stuff to grasp it. So what would you do with it?
Well, it's
and why we lose it? Why we?
Yeah, it's symbolic and imaginative. All right, I'm not saying there really was Eve. I believe there really was Mary, but of course, again, the misogyny is there. You can find it from the beginning. But reading some of the early texts of the church, and something that again continues through the Middle Ages, Mary is Eve's advocate. And In fact, my PhD was called God's Mother, Eve's Advocate. And I think we need to go back and see what this tradition is doing. And it's almost in some patristic writings to me that people look at Mary and say, what if she had said no? And they see Eve. And Eve in that becomes easily more a symbol of vulnerability and ordinary human fallibility, not this evil sexual
female weakness.
Well, of just the weak of our humanity, vulnerable,
weakness,
and women, the particular vulnerabilities women experience, which is domination in marriage often and bearing children in pain. Eve bears the pain of the female condition, not the wickedness, the pain. And in Mary is Eve's promise, you know, God is with you, Eve, God is redeeming you. And this virgin body isn't a punishment, it's a promise that whatever you've experienced, this is the body that God has for you. This is the body God sees in you, not Eve. Not Eve the way men in the church see her anyway. So again, it's playing with the symbols, and I can understand, I think, that, you know, it was a poor woman, a woman who was misunderstood. I mean, clearly in Mary's culture, they didn't believe the story about the angel.
Yeah.
There are references to, isn't this the son of Joseph? And excuse me, I've got
there are beautiful references in the Jewish texts, where, you know, it starts to, there's a mocking of that story. Interestingly, though, with some respect for Mary, I mean, she's strict always. Like she's never wicked in those stories that are mocking the story of virgin birth, which is striking.
And of course, Mary is Magnificat. You know, there is so much in the New Testament to me that's hidden in plain sight. How does the story of Jesus begin? With a woman in direct communication with the angel, but with God's messenger. What's the first homily? It's when Mary goes to visit Elizabeth and sings the Magnificat. And then when Jesus steps out of the tomb, who meets him? Mary of Magdala. So why is it that a story that is completely framed by women's power to preach the good news, first in the incarnation and then in the resurrection, has been hijacked by men who say women must keep quiet? It's an extraordinary sleight of hand. And, you know, I think if we just go back to scripture and open ourselves to what it says, we see that the age-old struggle for the fullness of redemption maybe is the struggle of gender, the struggle of women to live what's promised, and of men to refuse them the permission to do that. But ultimately, men don't have that power. The permission they withhold is a permission already given by God. And how do we live that? That's a conundrum.
Yeah. When you said that if we stick with Magnificat only with this liberation part, I mean, I do like that part, but I do like also digging more in Magnificat. I mean, it's like one of the best, you know, images and moments, and it's also in art. But I like to think that she's also so Jewish in it. I mean, this is really weird how Jewish woman from the little town knows all of that, but okay, but that's so Jewish of her to be in this prophetess position of reading the signs of time and saying, this is what's going to happen, because I know that that's what we are waiting for. And this is not only about liberating people in the sense of like poor and like flipping the structure of the world, but it's also about, you know, the yearning of Israel and the yearning that she's aware of, and the whole tradition of the Bible that speaks about it. So she's really this kind of, you know, this figure that comes from that tradition with those hopes. She's so rooted in it, and it's so strong and powerful in that one song, which is not only, again, about the poor, but it's about all of that. So that's always very striking, that she's so much of, you know, the voice of the of the Israel there in the core of Christian story. And I mean, of course, there's more of that voice in the Christian story because this was pretty much a Jewish story. But
Yeah.
but she in particular in that moment, it's like, oh, it's happening, and I'm the one to read it from my little pregnancy that is not showing up yet.
Yeah, that's lovely. And of course, yes, she would have known it because it's also modelled on Hannah's song, and it has echoes of other Jewish foremothers. So as a Jewish woman, girl, she'd have grown up in this tradition, and she would have known the scriptures orally and psalms and praises. And I mean, I just imagine Elizabeth and she dancing and banging tambourines like Miriam in the Hebrew Bible. But also, you know, there's some work, not a lot. There's more between Muslims and Catholics, but between Jews and Catholics, there's also a conversation about Mary, because the Catholic Church doesn't claim Mary is divine. So there's not that doctrinal problem about the humanity and divinity of Jesus. And she is a Jewish woman. She's the one who kind of connects, if you like, the link between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And you know, there's a lot can be done around that. And of course, in Judaism, Jewish identity is matrilineal. It doesn't matter who your father is. You're Jewish because of your mother. So Jesus takes his humanity and his Jewishness from Mary. So there's a lot that we need to reflect on. And also, of course, Mary features very significantly in the Quran. She's the only woman with a chapter of the Quran named after her, and she's highly revered by Muslims. Here in Britain, I know that some mosques have nativity scenes because, again, while they have a problem with Christian claims about the divinity of Jesus, they have no problem with even with the virgin birth. They embrace a lot of that because it's in the Quran. So, you know, Mary is for me a figure of mediation, a figure of, well, she and Christ. You know, the other thing that bothers me is when, and this comes from my own Protestant upbringing, what does it say about your attitude to mothers if you see Mary as somehow in competition with Jesus for honour? You know, the incarnation cannot happen without a mother. And it cannot happen without the incarnate one. So this isn't a competition. It's not like, oh, is Jesus higher or do we make Mary higher? It's like together, this is how it happened, you know. Why would God be bothered about people being afraid of recognizing that Mary was the divine choice?
When we talk about Jewishness, I was thinking, I have one problem with, I mean, I have two probably parts of my heart. That one goes to exploring and showing Mary more as the Jewish woman of her time. And because it also brings a lot back to Catholicism, Christianity, of what we've lost through ages of polemics and hatred. But on the other hand side, there is such a worth, and I see there is such a such a need of those ethnicized Marys that will be more South American or Black or Japanese or this or that, and it's all beautiful, but you know, it actually goes a little bit against each other. So this one is reminding incarnation was real and it happened in Israel, here into a Jewish woman. And this one makes it yours, which let you embrace her, and I guess you feel more embraced when she's yours. But it's not privatizing, but it's doing something else. I'm thinking about all of those, you know, not only about those pictures. This is the lovely image I have from a parish in Vija in Buenos Aires, where, you know, all of the different migrant groups had their own Mary on the wall. So you had the altar with like 5 different Virgin Marys, because each of the group has to have their own. I mean, this one, you know, Argentinians have Lujan, someone else from Bolivia has something else, and you know, it's like, and this is something that is very also strong with Mary somehow, that she's so identified with nations. She's Queen of Poland, she's Queen of Mexico, she's Queen of other places possibly, but in a sense that people feel that she is their mother, and they kind of picture them like them. Do we have a problem here? Do we have a potential here? What's going on there with
For
adapting
me,
it, I guess?
for me, in the working out of the Christian story, we are in the midst of salvation history. And that history has a very dark side and a very promising, hopeful side. And we have to accept that we live at the point of confrontation between the two. And often, well, we see in all aspects of the Christian tradition that confrontation. We see it today in the support for Trump's deadly policies by people who call themselves pro-life, Christian, many Catholics among them. And Mary, for me, is also part of that struggle. So she will always be co-opted by those who use power abusively. And she will also always, to me, be a symbol of liberation and hope for those who, and of course that, I want to say, that is where the Christian promise is finding its expression in spite of these other things. And I think it's the same with these enculturated images. We have to almost triangulate this. We have to say Jesus was born into a particular culture at a particular time, and he was Jewish. And something in the very, very dark history of Christian-Jewish relations and Christian persecution of Jews, of course, culminating in modern anti-Semitism and the Shoah, calls us to retrieve the Jewishness of our story. But at the same time, I would want to say there's also something about the position of the people of Israel in the world into which Jesus was born, which was a small colonized nation under tyranny, and he wasn't even born in the center of that. He was born on the margins of that. So I would also want to say, well, today maybe he'd be born in Palestine rather than the heart of Israel, because
or even probably in the corner of the world that we don't even read the news from,
or Yemen,
pretty much,
he would be born somewhere where the powers that claim God on their side are using violence, and he would be a victim of the violence, because the de-violencing, that's a horrible expression, but the deconstruction of God is, to me, what the incarnation is about. And so there's the Jewishness of our story, which is vital, and in view of our terrible history, it is so important. But it's also the reason why I really resist the idea of progress, or the idea that one culture says, let's get rid of these images. I mean, we live in a time now of destroying statues, and that's a very complex issue to debate. But to me, we have to say Mary is fully human in whatever context people are fully human. And Pope Francis writes beautifully about this. The incarnation has to happen in cultures. I wish he would recognize that women are also incarnate in cultures. Feminine genius is not something that floats free of bodiliness and culture anyway, but also that we have to keep the kind of mother of God, so that other generations, other cultures, changing perceptions have something that transcends them. So it's those three things. There's
a particular and universal,
cultures, and transcendence. And to me, the tradition has all those, and we have to maintain a balance. And we also have to then constantly look at where she is being used to brutalize and control people, as she has been used against women and is still being used against women.
A paradox for Polish context of 15th of August is that this is also a date of a great battle outside of Warsaw against Bolshevik army in 1920, and surprisingly we won. It doesn't happen often in our history, so this is seen as a victory of Virgin Mary, because that was her day. And when you're saying about her being involved in all of the violent things, I mean, this is a little different because it's a defense, but still she's often also on the flags and on the military context, right? And she's used there as a patron. She's often used in Polish history as a patron of battles or the defense of fortresses. This would be for Częstochowa, which is this Marian shrine and famously defended by Virgin Mary inside. So she's often there. But this is also a time of pilgrimages that will not happen this year. Usually there is a national pilgrimage to Częstochowa for the 15th of August, and this year some people do it spontaneously alone or some smaller groups, but it's not massive like it usually is. Do you have any experience? I mean, I know that you go to Lourdes, but I wondered, how is a great dogmatic mind or a great theological mind dealing with the folk or pilgrimage, folk Marian devotion or pilgrimage and shrines like that? And I'm not sure, I haven't been to Lourdes. I've been to Fatima. Difficult place for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm always very disoriented in those places. I've been to Częstochowa years ago, and I do like the image, but I don't like getting to it through all the shops, and all of that is just difficult. So, how do you find it? And
yeah, I have Our Lady of Częstochowa above my bed, actually. My daughter went on a school trip to Poland. She brought me back a little icon when she was a teenager, and I have it hanging on the wall. It is a wonderful image, and with the scar down her face from a vandalism attack. So yeah, it's complicated, and it's why I resist a kind of cleaning up of the imagery. The world is painful and violent and bloody. And if we want the incarnation to be real, I don't think we can rescue the figures within it from these conflicts. So, to say, I've seen pictures of American bombers going off to bomb Iraq with images of the Virgin and crosses and things on their fuselage. And it's such a revolting image. I just don't have anywhere to put it. But at the same time, I don't want to be part of a pious, otherworldly, new agey, we're all nice and we don't do violence. Violence is within every one of us. And there is something in each of us that can trigger that. And because we will always seek to say, God's on my side. That, I don't think we should kid ourselves about the kind of creatures we are. And that's why the Christian story is about failure and redemption and loss, not about perfection. So that's how we accommodate the kind of violent appropriation of the Christian story to me. Pilgrimages and popular devotions, I mean, I really, really struggled as a convert. And I first went to Lourdes, actually, only on condition that I could go as an academic. So I took a group of students and I devised a module on pilgrimage and said, we'll do a field trip. So that was the way I intellectualized it. But I've been back many, many, many times. And I find it the most perfect encapsulation of all the complexity of the Catholic tradition, because on the one hand, helping in the baths there, which I do every time I go now, I can't quite imagine that this is possible. I don't know what's happening to the baths in the COVID pandemic, but that you have these women modestly robed but naked in your hands, passing them through this freezing cold water, which umpteen sick bodies have been through before. I mean, it goes against everything modernity tells us we should be doing, and yet I don't very often feel very close to God. I'm a bit like Pascal. I take a wager on belief, but I don't have that emotional psychology that says, oh, I'm with God now. But when I go in the baths in Lourdes and I have weeping women trickling naked through my fingertips all afternoon, I'm touching God. I'm touching him in those bodies, vulnerable, female, weeping, loving, the prayers, the prayers that you hear. So Lourdes for me is heaven on earth. But there's also the contrast, which again is so about the church for me, that up on the hill you have the basilica, which in itself, access to the basilica was probably one of the first disabled access ramps in the world, because it had to be designed so that people could get stretchers and wheelchairs up to the church. So, but it's imposing. It's the power of the Catholic Church up there on the hill. But underneath is the grotto, wet, damp, female visceral female presence for me. In fact, when we take groups of students, they work so hard, but we usually end up in the cocktail bars in the evenings. And I remember one year sort of staggering down to the grotto well after midnight and giving them a lecture on the female symbolism of the well bubbling up. And you know, the rocks polished smooth. It's a place where nature and God, to me, meet one another. The story of Bernadette, you know, she hated the way they dressed her up. Again, she was one of the first saints of the photographic era, and she hated being this peasant visionary on display. I mean, she went off away from Lourdes and died in the convent in Nevers, never went back. So, you know, the choice of this poor, abused, neglected young European peasant girl it's just interesting. It undoes the romanticism. She's not a romantic figure, Bernadette. She was as exploited by the church as she was by the economic system she lived in. And yet she had such conviction. The whole power of the church tried to defeat her, and she would not give in. She did not give in. And, you know, I mentioned earlier, she didn't, you know, people say, oh, well, she would have seen statues of the Immaculate Conception and, you know, that kind of 19th century art that was all a bit inspired by Spanish art. And so that's the image of Mary she would have had in her mind. But it was the artist's image. And, you know, when she saw it, she called the apparition the thing. So there was a lot in her story that is quite astounding. But also, I love the tourist hat and the sheer tastelessness of Lourdes, because, you know, what do we want? Do we want God to come to some high class resort where rich people go? You know, poor people, one of the poorest regions of post-Enlightenment France, got a great financial boost by Mary appearing there. And what do we want Mary to do? Do we really want her to choose some tasteful 5-star hotel and, you know?
I'm going to imagine how Catholic intellectuals will create a Marian shrine. What would be happening there? But it actually, I mean, I would rather go to Fatima again. That would be very boring.
So the popular devotion, to me, that is incarnational. That is what the incarnation means. It means the carnivalesque reality of the human condition and the suffering and the joy and the unconstrained. There's something about Lourdes which the miracle is Lourdes itself. Whatever happened there in the 19th century, it is the miracle. To be there is to live the miracle.
So I want to land with the feast that in which context we are talking. We said a little bit about it, but I think that people do understand virginity. This is, you know, difficult maybe, but still very strongly present. But what is this, dormitio, or taking up Mary to heaven, telling us? And I do remember myself struggling with it, and this was like, it's this, first of all, the pilgrimage, second of all, the day of the Polish army holiday because of the one battle, and then it's also we bring flowers, so it's this folk thing, and like where there's meat for me there, where there's food for my thought and my spirituality there, with this whole army, pilgrimage, folk, everything. And I couldn't find it for a long time. Luckily, a dean of my theological faculty was a great Mariologist, and he was beautifully explaining it. But I know that so many people are like, this is nice, we'll take flowers, but what is it about for us Catholics?
Yeah, again, I go back to the redeeming of the human story from within and the need to accept the kind of creatures we are. Why do we need to be redeemed? Well, look what we do when we get hold of a good story. We mangle it to death. That for me is almost affirmation again. I don't want to be part of a pilgrimage of people I agree with. How boring would that be? Groucho Marx said, I wouldn't want to be a member of any club that would have me as a member. And that's a bit how I feel about Catholicism. If everyone was like me, it would be even worse than it is. So I can hold all that mess. But I think the assumption itself, I know Karl Rahner wrote very beautifully on this, and I haven't read what he wrote for some time, but he was dismayed when, you know, the doctrine was proclaimed. He thought it was a step against ecumenism. It was a problem, just as Cardinal Newman did, of course, with the Immaculate Conception. And what that produces, it's like the grain in the oyster that produces the pearl, because then we get serious theologians thinking very deeply and having to justify something. And I'm not sure if it's Rahner himself or if it was in a discussion about Rahner, but I remember a conversation when someone said to me, think of what it meant after the carnage that had happened in Europe during the Second World War, after the violation and degradation of the human body, and nowhere more so than in the death camps and the Shoah. Think of what it meant to say that there was definitely another body in heaven along with that of Jesus, and it was the body of a Jewish woman. Now, I know Rahner didn't particularly put it like that. I think the point being made theologically was this was a way for the church to say it's not just about the spirit, it's not about some abstract promise. Our bodies, these bodies that had been burned and gassed and bombed and violated and raped and starved and abused, these bodies are of eternal beauty in the eyes of God and are of eternal life. So for me, the Feast of the Assumption is, there are bodies in heaven. There's a male body and a female body, both Jewish bodies, both bodies that birthed a new tradition and a new world of conflict, but both bodies that say God births us into heaven, whoever we are, whatever gender, whatever messy story we trail with us. And so the assumption to me, particularly today, when I think the greatest challenge we face, all of us, whatever our religion today, is to reunite body and soul, God and creation, and to say, when we abuse creation, we abuse God's work. When we take matter to be meaningless in the light of the Spirit, we don't see what we are. We don't see the world as charged with the grandness of God, says Gerard Manley Hopkins. And the assumption for me is to say, yes, you know, this ordinary body is destined for heaven.
You mean that this feast will be saying yes to a matter and an ordinary body, and in this sense would be, you know, like when we come with those flowers from our fields, that would be praising and integrating back with everything. I mean, with this concept, with saying we will not abuse matter, we will respect it. Can we reinterpret it this way?
We respect creation. We respect the body. We recognize that the body is in God. You know, the sort of abstract metaphysics. The doctrine of the resurrection says, in ways we don't understand, there is materiality in God. But you know, today with quantum physics, it's not so hard to believe that, is it? Because we know that bodies are not these lumpen, solid, aging, whatever they are, COVID haircuts and going grey because I can't go to the hairdresser. The body is a shimmering vibrancy of subatomic desire, of particles that just...
That we don't even know that it's happening.
Yeah. So why is it hard to believe in the resurrection when science tells us that the material world is beyond anything we can imagine or understand? The assumption should be simple in the face of science. I know it's not.
Oh, but that's a beautiful way to think about it. I mean, that's I will take my flowers from the fields differently this year, Tina, thanks to you.
There will be flowers in heaven too. Those flowers are part of the eternity as well.